speaking. Thanks, Wendy Ann. We kindly ask the audience members keep videos off during the session to help support internet stability. If you have questions or comments, please send these to everyone via the chat function or use the Q&A interface. We ask that you do not raise your hands. And it's my privilege to formally welcome you to this session entitled Beyond the Individual Behind the Scene, a macro sociological lens on ethics and coaching. The session will be facilitated by a tremendously talented group of 4 individuals. I'm going to briefly introduce each of them now. We have Pauline Fotzen, who is deeply involved in coaching research and is an international educator and researcher in management. Paul Stokes, who is an associate professor of coaching and mentoring, a master practitioner with the European Mentoring and Coaching Council, and works with organizations and leadership teams on the development of staff. Hani Shukri, who is a researcher and practitioner of coaching, as well as a technology leader, and is interested in how coaching is shaped by its social context and how it can help reshape society. And Rashmi Dixit, who works extensively with senior leadership teams to discuss, debate, and design some of the most detailed strategies for implementing change across organizations. She has spoken on topics of decolonization, white supremacy, diversity, and inclusion. Please join me in welcoming Pauline, Paul, Hani, and Rashmi.
Thank you very much, Christine, for this introduction. And so thank you all for joining us to look beyond the individual and behind the scene. So on the coaching ethics scene, what do we see? Mainly we tend to see ethical issues framed in terms of individual attitudes, behaviors, choices, and responsibility. So the ethical questions are framed in terms of involved problems and in a certain limited context. We tend to believe that this is problematic. Why? Because it often leads to a blame game, like, okay, what did I do wrong? You know, this ethical problem is mine and I did something wrong. So this, what we call blame game, leads to what we call an individualization or psychologicalization of ethical issues. What does that mean? That means that there tends to be a reduction of ethical issues to individual problems or psychological problems that needs to be solved through psychological tools or psychological approaches. And we could say that by doing that, we tend to elude, we tend to forget the sociological, political dimensions that might have contributed to the ethical problem. So this is what we call the regression of the political to the personal. So this is what we tend to see in the dominant mainstream coaching ethics scene, both from professionals and academics. And tonight is an invitation to zoom out and and look at how the context might inform action, ethical action, and precisely these involved behaviors. Why? Because coaching ethics does not happen in a social vacuum. The way we behave, the way we think, our attitudes are shaped by a social context. So social context might be economic context, environmental context, industrial context, political context, that will influence the way we behave and the way we think about ethics and the way we frame ethical questions and issues. And so today, this is an invitation to look at how these contexts might inform the way we frame ethical issues, and an invitation to maybe rethink the way we frame ethical issues. And so for that, we have 4 presentations. Paul?
Yes, so just a quick overview of what we're going to do. We're going to have 4 tightly timed, brief sessions from the 4 of us. Hani is going to start us off in a minute looking at the global narratives shaping coaching conversations, and he'll say more about what that means. Then Pauline will take over and talk about neutrality, or beyond neutrality, which I believe was alluded to earlier in the day today. So Pauline will pick that up as promised earlier. Then I will look at things from an economic context around coaching conversations, and then we'll conclude with Rashmi looking at the self-governing bodies and coaching. And then we'll do, Hani will then do a quick, superb integration of all of those to sum up. And then we want to give a fairly big part of this. We've got to dealing with the things, the questions, the issues that come up for you. And the way we'd like to manage that is that as you listen to our presentations, if you could put questions in the chat at the time as they occur to you, then I will do my best then to facilitate a discussion at the end where we get the individual speakers, including me, to respond to some of those things and have a bit of a debate. So that's the plan for the session. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Hani.
Thank you, Paul. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. So if we can move to the next slide, please.
Yes, I did, I think.
And then back. I can only see the cover slide.
Okay.
Yes, here we go. So when we think of coaching, and forget for a moment social distancing, because a lot of coaching has happened on screens in the past 2 years. But normally when we think of coaching, it's reasonable to imagine two people in a room having a conversation. But what I want to invite you in the next couple of minutes, just to imagine this scene about zooming out of that scene, only to discover that these two people are not alone in the room. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of people in that room. They are all speaking. They are all they have their own voices. Who are these people, and what are they saying? And how does what they are saying impact the two people in the conversation? Who amongst those two people have brought these people in with them? So let's look at how the room is filled. So the room is filled maybe with family, or shall we say family systems. You might find work colleagues, or shall we say organizational politics. There are pandemics and wars in the news. There are economic, cultural, national, ideological, even ecological voices in there. So many patterns that are deeply affecting the conversation. The further away you move from the two people in the center, you start seeing some hazy and unclear patterns. We call them the macro systems. They are the ghost elephants in the room. Those ghost elephants, they have a huge impact on everyone in the room, and especially on the two people in the center. So I want to spend the next few minutes managing the time in a really careful way to discuss those macro trends. And I want to propose to you that when we move from coaching the individual to coaching the social to coaching the macro system, our choices and the ethical questions that we face are very different. So if we spend the next few minutes, and if we can move to the next slide, please, thank you, taking a quick tour of some examples. This is not a comprehensive list, and I can speak for hours on this, but let's start with one major macro trend, the existential crisis. In the last couple of decades, we have seen all the things that we used to anchor ourselves in, all the narratives that we used to anchor ourselves in, to become quite flimsy. If you think nationalism, religion, socialism, capitalism, even liberal individualism, nothing is a safe long-term home that you can imagine I can live there forever, because they're all being contested. Another trend, not at all invisible, since we're having this on screens, is the digitized self. how our presence in the virtual world of social networks have changed who we are. Which one of our virtual identities are we bringing into coaching? Which one of them is true? Because they are different. Which profile are we speaking when we're speaking about ourselves? And which profiles are left outside the conversation? And what is the impact really of coaching someone who is continuously wired into a worldwide network? If we look at the third trend, and it's one of contradictions, because in the years of social distancing and because of technology, we can say that we are living in the most connected time ever. We are literally in this session probably covering the entire globe. But at the same time, I think we'd be equally right to say that we are living in the loneliest time ever. And in this conflict, in this weird kind of combination of being the most connected and disconnected at the same time, the concept of society, of social support, which is very important to coaching, because you may argue that coaching in itself is another one of those mechanisms that comes to complement many of the other things that we live in, the family, the society, the neighborhood, the friendships, the communities, and there is the coaching, but society is being redefined and connectedness is being redefined, and we need to understand how is this impacting the bigger picture. Work is also being completely redefined, because now we have to rethink work that is no longer expected to happen inside the usual boundaries of time, 9 to 5, or of space. Work locations are being contested everywhere, or with the same people, because once you remove the aspect of space, suddenly you can be working with anyone, anywhere, on anything. So the terms of the contract are changing, but also the expectations of what organizations are here to do. There was a time where it was almost taken for granted, the right for businesses to be greedy, to go for profit, to be reckless, to be to do whatever it works, to ask for not ask for permission, but ask for forgiveness. This is changing, and we're living in a world where the organizations we're working with will now have to face bigger questions around their own ethics. On the fifth one, so while many things in the world are changing, I take a commitment every time I speak to remind myself and to remind everyone that some things do not change that easily. We are still living in a world where many people in the 21st century have to live under occupation, as kind of is very clear from this morning. In a world where we still have genocide, we still have racism, we still have gender discrimination, we still have class struggle, we still have political kind of discrimination, religious, etc. Some things persist, and in that persistence, almost there is the real challenge to the whole idea of hope. That coaching is one of the biggest kind of things that want to explore hope and drive hope, but we live in a world where billions, the larger percentage of people are suffering from one form of oppression or another. Lastly, to make things a bit more complicated, and as coaches, we act sometimes from a disposition of knowing better, kind of being trusted, but the world is living through a legitimation crisis. If we look beyond the wave of populism, we can see this crisis of trust between governments and people, and vice versa, between employees and leaders in organizations, with institutions, with experts, with the media, where you don't know what to believe, and arguably with all kinds of help that claims that I can make your life better. There is this level of distrust that we need to understand as a macro trend. So just to wrap up, and if we move to the next slide, we said that all of these trends are almost on the periphery of the room. When you move closer into the center, you find the more kind of the more obvious national, social, organizational, family systems. They might be louder, they might be clearer in their voice, but they are also affected by the humming of the macro trends. And in the very center, we have the two people we started with, our coachee telling their individual story, and the coach who is supposed to be neutral, listening to an individual story. And the question I'm asking, and the one that we're exploring in this session, which voices are being listened to, and how a coach can be neutral in while listening. So I'll hand over to Pauline to try to answer that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Hani. So yeah, we are going to try to share some insights around this idea of neutrality and whether neutrality should be revisited for coaching in the 21st century. And I would like to thank Philippe Wozinski, who this morning asked this question, is being neutral being ethical? So I'm building on this question because the question is, can we in the 21st century continue to coach as usual? So coaching as usual is for me the coaching that was developed in the 20th century. Basically, the coach is here to address mostly short-term economic goals. The coach is perceived as a scientist, an expert, an objective expert of the so-called reality of the coachee, and he or she is here to shape behaviors mainly for increased performance. And corresponding to this view of coaching as usual, there is what I call the neutrality as usual. What is neutrality as usual? Mainly it's defined in terms of suspension. The coach is kind of in suspension of his or her values, suspension of his or her emotions, and trying to maintain an equilibrium in the system of relationships between all the stakeholders. And together with other researchers, we believe that this neutrality as usual, and it's based on some research that we have conducted, it has at least three main limitations. It is partial, limiting, and limited. So partial, what does that mean? That means that this commitment to what J.D. Gannon called absolute neutrality is only representative of a certain approaches to coaching. So Hani, in your research, you said that the coach and the learning environment and the learner as neutral are representative of the training tradition. Sarah Erlo talks about certain approaches to coaching that are supporting coaching, such as behaviorism. So they are only representing a certain approaches to coaching. There are many other approaches like critical pedagogy, social constructivism that can also inform the way we practice coaching, but that tend to be neglected and overshadowed by what we call dominant approaches to coaching. And so this is limiting, and it can be dangerous. It can be dangerous because, again, based on some research, the coaches are facing dilemmas when they are always expected to appear neutral. And we found out that coaches might be involved in value compromising, meaning that they are not aligned in their values and they face ethical conflicts based on this disalignment. They can be manipulated and the object of power dynamics in the organization. And also the coaching relationship can lead to reification. What does that mean? It means that people are transformed into objects, into instruments. And coaches said, we didn't choose coaching to deal with objects. We want to deal with human beings, and we also are human beings. And the third limitation is that for the 21st century, this approach to neutrality might be limited if we believe that, again, as Julie Gannon is saying, we need to engage, coaches might need to engage in fighting or challenging corporate excesses, climate change, social inequalities. Hani is talking about social change in his research. So we might need for the 21st century what I call sustainable coaching. So what is sustainable coaching? Sustainable coaching is coaching that addresses more long-term global goals, not just economic goals, where the coach is embracing his or her subjectivity and acting as a critical reflexive partner, and might partly work with the client to explicit power dynamics in the system. And for that, we need engaged neutrality. So engaged neutrality is not so much based on suspension, but more based on an active neutrality, which means that the coach is conscientiously working on maintaining this neutrality or revised neutrality, where he or she is aware of his or her biases and practicing ethical responsibility by engaging in self-reflexivity. Today, there was a session by Rachel and Joanna who talked about meta-reflexivity, reflexivity and reflection. And so this is what we are talking about here, like how the coach is aware of the interest that he is pursuing, so self-reflexivity, what he or she is doing here, and critical reflexivity, meaning thinking about power dynamics that coaching is contributing to in the system. And so this was my part in this conversation, meaning that if we zoom out and we look at the broader picture of coaching and the coaching engagement, we might need to revisit neutrality as it was mostly applied in the 20th century. And I move, and we move to Paul, who is going to talk about the economic context for coaching conversations.
Yes, so I'm going to zoom out again here if we continue with our zooming metaphor. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the economic context. So I'm going to use touch on some economic concepts, but obviously also some ethical theory concepts. So to talk through. So if you go to the next slide, Pauline. So I guess a bit like Pauline's just said about humans and, we're all humans and we're not instruments. I guess the dominant narrative of coaching is that it's fundamentally a humanistic intervention focused on helping individuals and teams to develop to their full potential. And I guess the implicit message in that for me is that it should be available to all. It's almost a human right. However, is it available to all is the question I guess we need to ask. So if we conceive of coaching as a profession, I know that's often debated, whatever we call it, I think it's arguable that it has the following features. So there are barriers to entry for both suppliers and consumers. So if you're a supplier of coaching, if you are a coach, particularly if you operate in the US or in the UK, you would have to have a postgraduate qualification, probably a professional body qualification, and some sort of track record in order to earn money to do coaching. And not everybody has access to those things. So there is a barrier to entry to that, which can raise the price that people within the profession are able to charge for their services. There's also, of course, then a barrier to entry for consumers of coaching because they've got to pay for it, and not everybody can afford to pay for it. So that's one of the features. I guess the other feature of it, which could potentially work in the opposite direction to price, is one of supply, because you could argue there are relatively close substitutes in economic terms to coaching in the form of mentoring. I know we could have a big debate here about what's the difference between coaching and mentoring. I'm not proposing to do that here. But mentoring, counselling, psychotherapy, you might argue, are in broadly similar territory. And Hani was talking about the sort of existential crisis, and you might argue that psychotherapy might be a domain for that, for instance. But that will impact on the market, and also regulation from professional bodies in terms of a barrier to entry. So I suppose all of those things put together raises the key question of accessibility to coaching as a provider or a consumer for me. So if we go on to the next slide there, Pauline. So I just wanted to dip in to some basic ethical theories here. So one thing we can do when we're trying to judge what is ethical in coaching, because I guess that's one of the key questions we're concerned with in this conference, I guess. We can look at it from a utilitarian or consequentialist position and say, are we in the coaching market, are we providing the greatest good for the greatest number? Well, I guess if we go back to the previous slide that I've just articulated, we might question whether the greatest number of people are able to either supply it or demand the service. So that's one for debate. If we look at it from a Kantian perspective, Kantian ethics, and I know I'm glossing over huge bodies of historical ethical theory here, but just for expediency, it talks about the importance of ethics as moral duty. So is there a moral duty on us as providers, suppliers of coaching to provide access to it and break down those barriers to entry? Or do we simply have a responsibility, following the egoist position, to operate in terms of our self-interest? And that has implications, which I'll go on to talk about in a second, in terms of the whole idea around free markets and perfect competition, which is where the economic stuff comes in. So if we go on to the next slide there, Pauline. So I guess a core concept in economics is this idea of social efficiency, but within that, the ideas of allocative versus distributive efficiency, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So capitalist economies are argued to be better at allocating resources as to where they might best be used via the invisible hand, as it's known, of the market. I'm sure we've heard that term before, which was developed, I guess, many years ago by Adam Smith, the Scottish economist, in his book The Wealth of Nations in 1776. And you've got this rhetoric, I suppose, within economics of perfect competition. If we can have so many buyers and sellers in a market, the competition that ensues from that means that the price will be set at the social optimal level, because there are so many buyers and sellers in the market that no one individual or group of individuals can influence the market price in terms of monopoly power. I suppose we've got to question whether we're ever in that situation, though, whether we can ever argue that any market is characterized by perfect competition where resources are perfectly flexible, etc. If we move on to this idea of allocative and distributive efficiency, capitalist economies, as I've said, are better at giving resources to the places they can best be used via the profit signal as a way of attracting land, labour and capital to where they can best be used, but they're not particularly great at distributing wealth. A fair and even distribution of wealth is not a common characteristics of a capitalist economy. So I guess the question we then have is, to what extent can coaching practice within the global market be said to be ethical? I'll leave that one hanging. If we go on to the final slide from me, I guess if we turn to the concept of professional bodies, which Rashmi will say a bit more about, but it's possible to conceive of the professional bodies coaching as being one of these three things, possibly more. A, as moral guardians, charged with upholding the ethical standards of the coaching suppliers within the market. Keep out the cowboys, okay? Or, rather more cynically, we might say, coaching professional bodies are made up of self-interested actors ensuring the restriction of supply of coaching, thus make it possible to raise the market price via the barriers to entry. And we must have the economic ceteris paribus, other things being equal. And thirdly, we could say, well, actually, they're leading on the development of coaching and coaches, so as to expand the supply of coaching, thereby lowering the price of the things being equal. I think the important thing to finish off with from me is that all of these behaviours can be seen as ethical, depending on the ethical philosophy and criteria being adopted when we make that judgment. So I'm going to move on now and pass over to Rashmi, who's going to do the final talk.
Thank you, Paul. As my co-panelists have already unraveled the micro angle and the macro angle, I am mainly going to focus on the governance bodies as part of the coaching industrial complex. I'm going to look at the macro angle as well as the micro angle there. There are several self-governance bodies that have emerged in the field of coaching in the past 2 decades. They have taken upon themselves the task of standardization of coaching practices and competencies. Paul called them moral guardians. Here I'm depicting the metaphor of, the Batman and the Superman and the Wonder Girl. They have a strong influence on what is coaching and what is not. They decide the curriculum, certifications, credits, ethics, and network. Here I'm, also bringing in the fact that most of the powerful governing bodies currently are Eurocentric, North American, and white cis heterosexual in their identity and composition. These governing bodies, if decide to become defensive, or are probably defensive sometimes, they can be great barriers to creating meaningful shifts in the coaching profession. And I urge them to be open to this provocation that I'm providing right now. The problem is that the most institutions and organizations are looking for coaching are also looking for some legitimacy. And right now, anything that is Eurocentric, North American, and Western world approach is automatically considered legitimate. My friends Pauline, Hani, and Paul also talked about legitimacy at a macro level. Coaching industry has a deficit in application of researched and tested critical theories. Few, like my colleagues Hani and Pauline, have already tried to bring some nuances to the forefront. However, there are turf wars going on as to who controls and governs the coaching practice. As coaching is a humanistic tool and coaches powerful, very powerful change makers, the practices of governing bodies need a critical lens. As Simon Western says, make no mistake, accreditation and regulation means control, power, and formation of political power elites. Governance bodies need to reveal how resources, power, and control are managed, what gets more focus, what is marginalized, and why. A transparency in strategy will improve the quality of interactions and also build internal leadership competency within the governing body. I have attempted to show this extremely complex system of how the coaching industrial complex works. And there's a lot of information on this slide, so please forgive me for that. So the language that is used to create the lucrative entrance, coaching is for all, So please come join coaching, empower the world through coaching, ready to change the world, become a coach. We have no geographical boundaries. Your average income will increase significantly if you become a coach. By the way, I've picked this up from various governing bodies' websites. So this is not something that I'm saying, I've picked it up. So, and then, you will be your own boss, you'll have time flexibility. So how about we just move away from marketing jargon that promotes narcissism rather than self-reflection? We can't be part of the same hamster wheel, greed is good ideology when we are being looked upon as change makers for a better collective future. We have to think out of the box. How also coaching careers may need direction, but not an operating manual. Ethical, human, culture-centered philosophy with real-world application could be the starting point. As more and more people and organizations are stepping into the world of uncertainty, they are looking towards something different. Coaching seems to generously welcome people across the world who have access and ability to pay, like Paul said, for very expensive coaching courses. And this is a totally different global socioeconomic strata that can access and pay for coaching. As soon as students pay, they go through the training run by the faculty who are senior coaches, but usually not trained in group facilitation or cultural sensitivity. They also come from white lens and usually are from the network of the coaching schools, usually friends, family, colleagues of coaching school owners. Governing bodies do not regulate how coach training is done. The second barrier is cognitive abilities and the ability to sift through the Western education system of meritocracy that then decides whether you are a fit for coaching or not. Almost 20% of the students fall off the course and rest 80% continue to pursue their dream career, continuing to pay for memberships, volunteer hours, paying mentors, coaches. Some realize that the school they went to didn't fulfill all the requirements, so they again have to go for more training hours. And interestingly, none of this data is shared by the governance bodies. Some coaches also find it easier to make money and networks just by having their own coaching schools rather than coaching clients. And then they continue to perpetuate the same cycle that they went through. Another data that is not tracked is how many of these certified coaches actually become coaches and earn more than $47,000 in US that has been touted. Let's move to the second slide. In the future, the governance bodies will have to change their core from capture the market to holding humanism at the core of the design in their strategies that are visionary and culturally and futuristically relevant. This may include, but not limited to, focus on quality of assessments, faculty, and curriculum, valuing critique and critical research, study, research, change the game from market-centric approaches to research-centric approaches, keeping humanism at the core. And then finally, sticking to competency and niche of the leadership in the governance body. Like, for example, you can't have an executive coach assessing the coaching recording for a social justice activist coach. The context and purpose of coaching is totally different in these two scenarios. And there needs to be a little bit more transparency in this process. And at the end, I would say we'll need transformation. For the transformation, we do more and market less. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashmi. So very quickly then, so that we have enough time to have a discussion. We've almost shouted 3 times, kind of zoom out, zoom out, zoom out, and there is one around go back and reflect. In a way, we started with this idea of a bubble, this assumption that coaching happens in a bubble between coach and coachee. And we've tried to attack it from 3 different angles, almost. One, looking at the global dynamics that are affecting both of these people and everyone around them, and how this affects the coaching conversation. On the economic dynamics that affects everyone, arguably, in the world, but also within a coaching relationship that is many times is also a commercial transaction. And from a third angle, around the industry dynamics, the way you get into the industry and you keep within the industry, you learn how to do this, and you build your networks. And we almost in each one of these asked ourselves the question that Pauline then took us through in the second part around during that conversation, what neutrality means. Is it an individual kind of neutrality or a sustainable kind of neutrality? So with this, I'm hoping that I can see that there is a lot of conversations happening in the chat. So Paul, if you can guide us through the rest of the session then.
Yeah, I'll do my best. If we stop sharing the slides, that might be good. Then we can see people.
Yeah.
So there's quite a bit of there's quite a few comments around the debate around the role, and I suppose they're summed up by Bob's comment. Are professional bodies businesses operating on business rules, or are they genuinely interested in developing coaching? There's been quite a few comments and questions around that. So I suppose in terms of starting the debate off, I don't know if you wanted to sort of pick that up again, Rashmi, or say a bit more about that.
Could you repeat the question, Paul?
Yeah, so Bob asks, are professional bodies businesses operating on business rules, or are they genuinely interested in developing coaching for all?
I think that is a question we should check with the governing bodies. From my perspective, I feel like they're trying to do their best, but there is a lack of competence and lack of bringing in different perspectives, which could be improved in trying to make sure that they are able to, we are able to see that there is a genuine interest in developing coaching for all.
Yeah, and I think there were a few, someone asked, is price the only barrier to entry? So there's some questions, I suppose, around some of the stuff that I was saying. I guess in terms of that, I don't think it is the only barrier to entry. There are other ones. So from the supply side, for example, I run a master's course in the UK on coaching and mentoring, and I spoke to a number of coaches, a number of people on that course who have black skin, and they're saying to me, actually, I know I'm going to get less work as a coach. You know, I know for a fact that I will get less work. You know, and whilst that's incredibly depressing an indictment, I think it is a barrier to entry, seemingly for those people. So I think there are a range of other barriers like that, race, a number of the things that actually that Bob in your session earlier raised as some of those kind of what the phrase you use, contested or stigmatized conversations. So I think that would be one of them. Well, there were some points about saying, you know, why should coaching be any different to any other type of service that's offered? So I don't know if one of my colleagues wants to come in on that.
Paul, if I can jump in from the first question actually, and linking it to the third, I think this is exactly why we're having the conversation, because naturally you'd expect coaching to be like everything else happening in the world naturally. And this is the one I think I need to stress. You'd expect coaching bodies to evolve in the same way that all similar kind of bodies in other kind of industries have evolved, which is the problem. I guess it is the challenge. It is the fact that if we don't proactively think about this in a critical way, and we don't proactively engage in a conversation, then obviously all the theories that you've shared with us about how the market works, they make the market work this way. It's not because someone makes the choice to make it like this. It's the natural way things would happen, unless we intentionally make it different. I would say that the same if we were discussing something around the environment, for example, why companies would cause harm. For example, it's the natural course of action. If you're seeking profit and you're going after it, the only way to stop this circle is to have the conversation, is to say, okay, now do we really want to create a profession that will end up being following the same dynamics of every other profession, or should we try to make something different?
And I guess building on that, there's a question from Francine earlier in the chat. I don't know if Francine, you want to articulate it, but more than that's in the chat. You said, how might Hani's social trends inform a foundation for coaching that is more ethical as a practice and as a professional practice? Do you want to say some more about that?
Yeah, how many hours do we have?
Well, yeah. It's 13 minutes.
I've spent a good time of kind of my focus on coaching, writing about this question, actually thinking about how do we approach coaching as a social process, how do we approach coaching for social change. And in that part where I was examining the macro trends, it was very clear to me that we need to going back to what Rashmi was saying, for example, about the education of coaches and the curriculum, the kind of the principle, the ethics, etc. We need to think about hope. What does it mean in a world that these are the givens in it? And then you have a different model of coaching. We need to think about, I speak a lot about coaching for emancipation, because when we're working with oppressive kind of structures, then we have to be aware that we have it, the duty of care kind of expands a little bit to understanding the social struggles of the people we're working with. We need to think about coaching for sustainability, to use kind of Pauline's example in her speech, because then the curriculum needs to examine these issues. If we understand that these are the challenges, then we almost have to counter them with adding those very important words into what are we coaching for? Are we coaching for success of the individual, or are we coaching for all of these things that respond to these trends? Pauline, you want to add something?
I would like to build on what you are saying, because there is a question by Henry Campion, sorry if I mispronounce your name. You are asking the difference between an ethical position and being an activist. But I would like to be a little bit provocative, a little bit more. It's like pushing for performance. Isn't it also like a bias? Like we take for granted that it is normal to coach for performance. But what about substituting these to coaching for a sustainable world? Maybe we are moving from just one objective to the next, but I think nobody here is like kind of questioning or challenging if coaching for performance is a sort of activism. But I would argue that this could be activism, because this is one objective that we have chosen over another objective. We have prioritized the economic and financial objective over the care for the environment or the care for like social justice. So I think this is just a question of cultural bias that we are not even questioning, because we take this for granted. And my second point related to that is also how do we view sustainability? Are we still in an egocentric and anthropocentric view of the environment, where the environment is is something that is here to serve us, or is are we part of, or is the environment part of one element, and we are also part of this environment? So that's what I wanted to say in a little and question what we think is activism.
So I suppose we go back to that notion, I think, of what is ethical behavior in coaching. For me, that's what when we look at so is ethical behavior coaching for activism, coaching for a sustainable world? Is that how we're judging what's appropriate ethical behavior? I think it's an interesting question, but I still come back to this idea of, by what criteria are we assessing ethical behavior against? Because there are competing perspectives on what is deemed to be ethical. We can't assume that being ethical is something that we can all universally agree on and accept. We have to have the conversation to talk about what that actually looks like and how we're judging that. And I don't get the impression we're engaging with the existing ethical theories that are out there in terms of doing that. We almost have a universalist assumption that we all know what ethical behavior looks like when we see it. And I'm not sure we do.
And Paul, also one of the things that we need to also look at, and this is of course for discussion purposes, that whether the governing bodies, the current governing bodies are competent to hold the niche for all, like for example, climate change coaches. Is that something that the current governing bodies could go ahead and accredit, or climate change coaching courses? So there could be different niches, I believe, and not everything should fall under one umbrella. So when ethics starts falling under one umbrella, it can become oppressive, and we need to be mindful of that, I believe.
So there's still stuff going on on the chat, which of course I've been drawn into debate now, so I haven't looked at it. But Francine, I wanted to give you a chance to come in because I think you've made a few comments. I don't know if you wanted to raise something. Can't hear you. No, you're still on mute, I think. No, you've got. Let's try again. No. No, still can't hear you.
So
No.
can I add something then while Francine says her mic? I think looking at a lot of the questions, for me, another very important aspect, when we speak about ethics, it's almost as if we're assuming that this burden is on the coach's shoulders only. And I think the bigger challenge actually is how do we coach for ethical judgment in our for our coaches? How do we support them to make those ethical choices, and those ethical choices that they are confronted with are very difficult sometimes, because the coach can stand in one way, but then if they are coaching someone in an organization, probably their decisions are going to impact many more people outside their circle if they are coaching someone in society and so on and so forth. And I think a lot of the questions, a lot of the conversation that I can see here, we also need to somehow flip it on its head and ask ourselves, okay, how do we also support this conversation without even having to consider this for ourselves as coaches, but how do we stay in this room and help our coaches make sense of those very difficult questions that they are confronted with? I don't know if Francine is ready or not yet.
It's all gone wrong. Sorry, no, we can't. Yeah, sorry. You'll have to just rely on the voice of your words in the text, Francine, I'm afraid. We've got about 5 minutes left. Does anybody else want to come in and ask make a point or ask a question? Please just unmute yourself and do that.
I would just make an observation, something that I found very useful learning from other conversations on ethics, which is that really, instead of trying to be all things to our people, it is more advisable that we take ethical positions on a domain of knowledge which we know, we control, etc. So this is just the idea that can we start a debate and talk about ethics in climate or mining or whatever? And yes, we can, but actually it's not very useful because that's not a domain of competence where we can go in and tell the mining organizations how to do their mining, etc. But rather stick to the domain where we can have mechanisms to improve and to change, and the knowledge to do so. And so we are back really to maybe just looking at how the industry of coaching is being run. What are the ethical problems? And there are so many, I wouldn't begin to list how many they are because they are biased in favor of profit, making money, etc., etc. We all know that. And very, very flexible boundaries between all the players who literally, you know, put money in the pockets of each other, etc., etc. And anyway, so there are a lot of problems within our system. So I'm thinking that, you know, talking about ethics and this and that and the universe and the cosmos might not be the most, we need to clean up our own act. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I've got some sympathy with that, because I think it needs to be a focused. Whilst we're talking about, we've said it loads of times now, and this zooming out, etc. But there's got to be a zooming back in to some extent, in terms of how this applies, as you say, in the industry, and down to the level of how does this work within the dyad, as well as in other subsystems, the organisation, groups, etc.
And I don't dismiss the zooming out because it's the outside forces that determine our focus, the direction of the focus. You know, 100 years ago, the focus discussion would have been still influenced by the society at the time. So we are listening and we are receptive and we are flexible. Influence from the outside, you know, the general changes. But we still stay focused on what we can. So I'm not dismissing the outside influences because the ethics today are not the same as 50 years ago, etc., etc.
For sure. I think we've got to finish in a minute, but if anybody else just wants to make a quick point before we do, hand back over to Kristen. Or have we talked out now? Put the world to rights, literally. Okay. Okay. Thanks very much. I'll hand back over to Kristen then to close the session.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here, for the lively conversation within the chat, and for our wonderful presenters. Thank you so much. And to the sponsors of this event, Wendy Ann, everyone involved, thank you so much. And wherever you are in the world, have a wonderful evening, night, and day. And we'll see you in the closing session here in a few minutes. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
So yeah, this is a closing now.